Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's my pleasure to be here in support of HJ5. For the record, my name is Tom McGillvray. I represent Senate District 26 out of Billings. I'm going to be very brief today, but as Representative Clacken has said, you clearly understand Article 5 has two processes to propose amendments. And then the states, there are two processes for the states to ratify those amendments, either go through state legislatures or state conventions. I would submit to you that Article 5 is probably the bastion of federalism in the United States Constitution, in that as you know, federalism is the division of power between the federal government and the states. So it's critical when this Constitution was drafted and ratified that division of power was maintained. As you know, there were a group of anti-federalists who were very opposed to the Constitution in the ratification process. And their concern was that there was too much power given to the federal government. I would submit to you today that if not for Article 5, the Constitution may well not have been ratified, but they were confident that in Article 5, it gave the states power to push back on federal power. Samuel Jones, who was a leading New York ratifier and a moderate anti-federalist, said, "We didn't know when we ratified the Constitution if we gave the federal government too much power or too little, or we left the states too little power." So there was two modes of proposing amendments. One was given to states, one was given to federal government. The power given to states was simply a check on federal power. So real briefly, I'm just going to review with you the process that the framers went through to come to the final version of Article 5 that we have in our Constitution today, because I think it's insightful about the intent on maintaining federalism and state power in Article 5. The first draft of Article 5 was by the Virginia, came with the Virginia plan, and that article said this: resolved that provision ought to be made for amendments of the Articles of Union whenever it so shall seem necessary, and that assent of the national legislature ought not to be required. So the first version of Article 5 was the states would propose amendments, the national legislature would have nothing to do with it. It was entirely state-based. The next version, which came about in Article 9 in the second draft of the Constitution, it says, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states of the Union for an amendment to this Constitution, the legislature of the United States shall call a convention for that purpose. So in this case, the states would apply, the national legislature or Congress would call the convention, and the states would propose the amendment. So again, the only role that the national legislature had was in calling the convention for the states to propose amendments. The third draft that came about in September 10th of 1787 said the legislature of the United States, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem necessary, or on the application of 2/3 of the legislatures of the several states, shall propose amendments to the Constitution. So there was a strong problem with this third draft, in that the anti-federalists, particularly Mason, was very alarmed about it, because the only way to propose an amendment was through the national legislature. So he stood up and said, if this is the article that we're going to have, then it will leave no opportunity for the states to propose amendments, and then the federal government will become oppressive. It was kind of a daw moment for the whole entire assembly there, and they frankly agreed with Mason, and so they came up with the current draft of the final Article 5 in the Constitution. I want to read what Mason said in his notes on his copy of the September 10th federal Constitution. He said, if you don't have a process of state-based amendments, as we're talking about today, he said, this is a doctrine utterly subversive to the fundamental principles of the rights and liberties of the states. The point being here is that Mason, a leading anti-federalist who didn't sign the Constitution, was deeply concerned that if there was not a state-based process of proposing amendments, then the states would lose power and federalism would be lost, and ultimately you would have federal tyranny. I would submit to you today that that's close to where we are today, with $36 trillion of debt, $2 trillion annual deficit, half of which is interest on that debt service or debt. We're at the brink of losing our fiscal solvency. We have the federal government encroaching on every area of the reserve powers of the states. For example, the federal government's encroaching on our water, our air, our power, our wildlife, our water, everything that you can imagine. The federal government has encroached in the state powers. Unless the states push back through Article 5, we will lose our nation. We will lose our fiscal solvency, we will lose our liberties, and we will lose our rights. So I would encourage you to remember that Article 5 is the bastion of federalism. Without it, we will no longer have a country, and that's why we're here today, because there are many patriots in the room today who are deeply alarmed, regardless of whether they're supporting this resolution or not. They're all deeply alarmed about the state of our nation. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I appreciate a due pass on this resolution.